one where a video game isn't something relegated to a dark closet where someone stashed a mainframe terminal. They are in people's homes, in bars, in dedicated arcades where many spend more money to play a simple game of electronic ping-pong than they have spent on pinball or any other mechanical game to date. The date being, of course, 1973. Some may remember it as the year when Ethernet was created at Xerox PARC, the year that we got a first look at a wireless future through the development of packet radio, as well as a clear glimpse of the future internet through the interconnection of two different networks, the French Cyclades and the British NPL. There was a lot of stirring in technology at the time and in the world at large. The Sydney Opera House opened, the US shipped out of Vietnam, Greece became a republic abandoning the monarchy, and the newly Brexited then entered the fledgling community that would become one day the European Union. Oil prices rose by 200% as well, and OPEC issued an embargo to not export oil to the USA, which would have been a good sign that maybe this whole oil thing should be reconsidered in the long term. In happier news, Pink Floyd released The Dark Side of the Moon. George Lucas became a millionaire with American Graffiti, and even in Romania the movie business was booming, much like this new thing called the video games industry that everybody wanted a piece of. This is when Midway moved up from mechanical arcade games to arcade video games, a space it would play a major role in up until arcades died. And it didn't do it with its own game, but with the licensed version of Atari's Pong called Winner. Midway was actually able to out-manufacture Atari, creating more arcade units than Bushnell's own team could, being an already established company with manufacturing potential. And it wasn't the only company of its kind to enter the video game market at that time. So did a vending machine and jukebox company named Title, a name that will be a lot more important in a few weeks, as at this point it was responsible mostly for a Pong clone named Elopong. The Konami we know and love was born in 1973, although it didn't get into games right away. And Sega, a well-known maker of mechanical coin-operated games, entered the video game market with its own Pong clones. As for Atari itself, it didn't stop at just Pong. It made a 4-player variant of it called Pong Doubles. It made a maze chase game called Gotcha, where 2 players were chasing each other in a constantly changing environment. Space Race had a similar idea, an Atari game where 2 players were trying to pilot ships in a straight line, racing towards the end of the screen, dodging dots and hoping to win. It's one of the first racing games ever made, at least in video game form, because there were mechanical ones in the past, in a way. These new games, and especially Pong, helped Atari earn over $1 million a month. Enough capital with enough reputation to continue striving upwards and onward in spite of what other companies in the industry were hoping for, namely that Atari would die out and they would not have competition. But Atari did not die out, it grew. This was not going to be an easy fight for the likes of Sega or Midway. Outside of the industry, people were still experimenting with video games and enjoying themselves without the clamor of this newfangled market. One of the most basic and yet popular business simulators was developed for the first time in this year, Lemonade Stand, made by Bob Jameson working for the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium. Its premise was simple. You are running a lemonade stand with all that it implied, such as buying lemons, sugar, mixing them, deciding on a price, repeating until 12 rounds passed and you were hopefully profitable. Later iterations of this game would go on to more ludicrous extents, though not as much as the paperclip game. And yet this was another mainframe game that wouldn't be available to the masses just yet, and neither would be the precursor to one of the most popular game genres in history. You could say that the first-person shooter was born in the year 1973 in the form of Maze War. It was created by a few bored people at NASA like Steve Coley, Howard Palm, and Greg Thompson that came up with the idea of sticking people into a first-person maze and then having them hunt each other down. To do that, they needed two MLAC PDS-1 machines that they managed to link together over a serial port in a way that wasn't really done all that much at the time. It was the first time this perspective was used in a game that I know of. It is the first FPS game, the first multiplayer FPS game, the first in many other aspects. Maze War and the updates it would get in the next few years were responsible for things like the first network played game, the first client-server network games, one of the first level editors, in-game avatars for the players, internet play, cheat protection, even an encrypted source code, though that wouldn't necessarily be a great thing. Its ideas spread throughout mainframe games in the 70s and would disseminate into more accessible games once consumer technology caught up with the equipment that Maze War and its progeny were created on. That dissemination continues to be a core value of the video games industry, and it was in 1973 that it got a really big boost thanks to a book called Basic Computer Games, a compilation created by David H. All of many games that were submitted to the Deck newsletter and were created over the past few years by many people on various platforms. All ported them to Basic and shared the source code with everybody through this book. This is how games like Hammurabi were spread, and the starter game we talked about a few weeks ago, as well as many others. Wherever there was a machine that could run Basic, now anyone able to type out the code could play it. The book also highlights the fact that although I've only covered a couple of games in the series so far, a lot more were created. As for exactly how important they were, how much of a game they were, and as to what their impact is, I am not one to judge. The game of 1973 can be no other than Maze War. It is deep enough back in history that many may not see it as big of a progenitor of the current first-person games as much as Doom or Ultima Underworld would be, but it inspired the foundation of the precursors that led to the inspiration of these games. It is a fundamental brick upon which a lot of what we have now in gaming was built upon. So the year closes, the birth of a new genre, and next week we're going to have even more. Goodbye.